Welcome everyone to the Grand Challenges for Social Work's webinar, The Social Worker's Guide to Effective Policy Advocacy, Writing and Placing Op-Eds. We're grateful that you all could make it and excited to have this webinar take place. Just so you know, we envision this as potentially one in a series of webinars. We want to quickly mention that op-eds aren't the only way that you can do policy advocacy, obviously, but they might be one effective way that you don't know about, and we're hoping to provide you some more information about that. We have some really great panelists. First, we'll have Lisa Reyes-Mason, who is now intern dean at the University of Denver. And it's kind of exciting. Me and Lisa, I can remember back at Brown School when she was a student there and I was a student, and now we're doing a webinar on the Grand Challenges. Quite awesome. And then we have Matt Epperson, and he's an associate professor at the Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy and Practice, University of Chicago. Jenny Ramich, professor at Northwestern University, and she's director of West Coast Poverty Center. And then we have John Bielsen, who is president of Strategic Communications and Planning. And he's done a lot of work with the Grand Challenges around op-eds and writing op-eds. He's going to be our expert on kind of how to write the op-eds. And so all of our panelists have written op-eds and placed them, and I'm going to provide you with some comments and ideas about why it might be important. We're going to start off with Lisa Reyes-Mason.
Thanks, Willie. So glad to be here with you all. Thanks to the Grand Challenges for organizing this. As Willie said, I'm Lisa Reyes-Mason, currently interim dean and associate professor at the University of Denver Graduate School of Social Work. I use she, her, and she pronouns. And yeah, like Willie said, it does feel a bit full circle because the Center for Social Development actually at the Brown School, which is how Willie and I first met and worked together, and Lisa also, is where I feel like I first really learned and started to live and breathe the importance of doing applied research that has public impact, thought about from the beginning. And so using our expertise, our ideas, our opinions through something like op-eds is one way to make that happen. So I will share in my time a little bit about 3 of the 4 op-eds that I've written, and then some of my thoughts. So I'll start off with the first one. The first one was an op-ed in the Knoxville News Sentinel, Rules for Talking About Our Changing Climate. Why did I write this one? It was homework. I was on faculty at University of Tennessee, and I was participating in a 2-day op-ed training project. It was excellent training from the op-ed project, in which, the goal of it was to teach academics a formula, really, for how to write an op-ed, how to bring our expertise further into the public conversation, how to establish our credibility. John will talk more about how to write the op-ed, so I won't say too much about the formula I learned, but we also learned how to, reach out to editors, get our op-eds placed. And so the first op-ed I wrote was homework, the first night of the training, and it took me about an hour to write it. And that's probably my first tip, I guess, I'd like to offer, is that the op-eds I've written, when it comes down to it, they just haven't taken that long to write. And so it can be kind of a quick way to get your ideas out there into the world. Every one I've done has taken an hour, maybe 2 at the most, to actually have a solid draft on. The second op-ed came out of more out of a disaster, actually, kind of some wrestling, some academic heartbreak, in a sense, really, after a tornado disaster in Tennessee that happened when I was on faculty there. We had a project with funded by NOAA for several years, studying nighttime tornadoes in Tennessee and how to help keep the public safe. And we had built in applied public impact work from the beginning, close partnership with the National Weather Service, a public website, with infographics as our research was coming out, really trying to take our results into practice as soon as we could. But this devastating nighttime tornado happened in Tennessee, and as part of that, I ended up writing an op-ed about public impact scholarship and the urgency of it, how important it is to while we've chosen an academic career, which is very different from choosing to be full-time advocates or activists or community organizers, kind of wrestling with my own research. Had I done enough? What could I have done more of? Which is what I wrote about in this op-ed. What could I inspire others to do with their own scholarship? And importantly, in the op-ed, how could I shape academic institutions to value and support public impact work better? So that was kind of the why of the second op-ed. And again, it felt so personal at the time that the actual writing of it, again, didn't take long to do. The ideas were already there, bubbling under the surface for some time. The third one I'll mention is the most recent one, which was in the national outlet, The Hill. And so this is specifically about a bipartisan bill, the Community Mental Wellness and Resilience Act. And this one came out of several years of partnership with Sarah Butts, which began when she was actually executive director of the Grand Challenges. Sarah has since become director of public policy at NASW. And Sarah and I have kept up a very good collaborative relationship over the past 3 to 4 years, where she reaches out to me from time to time to weigh in on different policy priorities or bills related to climate change or environmental justice. And so this op-ed grew out of that partnership, really. So kind of a more of a buildup to it. Sarah had asked me to weigh in on the draft of that bill that I mentioned. The bill would provide more community-based funding for mental health in the face of the climate crisis. It was a bipartisan bill, first introduced, I might get my years wrong, but I think it was first introduced in 2021. And then I weighed in on it behind the scenes again in 2022. I was then participating in DU's Public Impact Fellows program and decided to write an op-ed about this bill. I tried to place it in early fall of 2022, but it didn't get any hits at that time from any of the editors we sent it to. I held on to it, and then when the bill was reintroduced later, a few months later, we sent it out again, and then it got picked up right away by The Hill. So that's it's an example of an effective hook, quote unquote. In this case, the hook of the op-ed was a relevant date that mattered, the bill being reintroduced in this case. So in the couple minutes I have left, just a few of broader thoughts. One thing I love about writing op-eds is writing them in my own voice. They feel more like me and my voice and my writing than probably 99.9% of my journal articles do. As I've mentioned, we have expertise, opinions, ideas to share. Academic publishing, as we know, can be slow and painful. Op-eds are one way of disseminating our work and ideas that can be quick. And we don't always know. One of the questions we were asked is, what impact? Did it have the intended impact? I think what I can say is that I'm not always sure. You don't always know. Sometimes people reach out to you after it, share their ideas. Sometimes people certainly criticize you online in the comments. Some of the impacts, I have had journalists reach out to me for interviews for my expertise on other stories because they had read my op-eds. Certainly the op-ed on the bill that I mentioned has been used by NASW and other coalitions to support their ongoing advocacy on this bill. And it's part of building, I feel like for me, it has been part of building my reputation as a public scholar. And so I've continued to get invited to other kinds of decision-making tables of influence. I think, maybe I'll conclude on just a practical note of advice. One thing I hope you'll take from this webinar, I hope you'll put 2 hours on your calendar. The first hour that you put on there, go over the notes from today, pick a topic you want to write about, think about an outlet. Is it local, regional, national? And then in that second hour on your calendar, practice what you learned from today and write your op-ed and then send it out there. I think I'll stop there. Thanks, Willie.
Thanks a lot, Lisa. That's very helpful. Matt, I think you're up next.
Thanks, Willie, and thanks to the Grand Challenges Executive Committee for inviting me. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk with folks. Really, probably in many ways, I'm going to build on what Lisa already said, but I was sort of thinking about, why should we be writing op-eds? And to me, it's a really important opportunity for social work practitioners and scholars to continue to do what we should already be doing, which is applied work and thinking about how our work applies to real world situations. how to add a social work perspective to that and speak to social justice concerns. I also think it can be a great opportunity to merge conversations around practice and research and speak to timely issues. You know, I think Lisa's examples and the examples I'll talk about connect with particular sort of timely issues, and to engage in a broader conversation, you know, outside of the academia, outside of our own profession. And I was reflecting back. I looked at the 3 op-eds that I sent in, and they were all written in. Well, one was written in 2015. The other 2 were written in 2016. So I guess maybe that was just a year where, not coincidentally, the grand challenges were starting, and so there were lots of conversations around sort of these ideas. And, you know, as the co-lead of the Promote Smart Decarceration grand challenges, we were definitely having conversations with community folks, with researchers. We did a conference, and so I think there was some generative, you know, not always your typical, you know, academic sort of siloed conversations, but really engaged conversations. And so I think that felt like a good platform to start engaging in broader discourse. The first one that I'll talk about is, it was actually initially sent to through the Safety and Justice Challenge, which was a funding mechanism through the through MacArthur Foundation, where they were really trying to advance practice and policy work aimed at reducing the jail population, which is clearly relevant to the grand challenge that I helped lead around decarceration. And we had a particular purpose in writing this op-ed, which was really to suggest to MacArthur and to anyone who would be funded through this major initiative to really center and include the voices and the experiences and the leadership and the expertise of people with lived experience of incarceration. And so that was really our agenda for writing this. It was something that I was trying to do in my own work around advancing research and policy around decarceration. And so we basically centered on that idea. And we're hoping that folks that were in the Safety and Justice Challenge network, you know, would be challenged by this and think about how to make sure people with lived experience were not just an afterthought or a sort of token representation, but had active leadership seats at the table. And then that was later picked up by Medium.com. And I think you know, what I really try to do in that op-ed and the other couple that I've written is to try to provide some real world examples of how this work can be done. So we talked about, you know, our own conference development and how it was integral to partner with folks with lived experience. The second op-ed came sort of as an opportunity just through networks, you know, that I had developed. You know, you sometimes never know where, you know, these conversations you have with colleagues and with friends will lead. And a lot of my practice experience was in working with people with serious mental illnesses who were caught up in the criminal legal system. And after a tragic shooting and killing of a young person named Quintonio LeGrier in Chicago, you know, where I work, he was shot by police in late 2015, and they were responding to a mental health call, a mental health crisis call that unfortunately gets routed to police in most, still in most jurisdictions. And so I was able to be connected to an op-ed editor at the New York Times. And I think unlike the other couple, which I totally agree with Lisa, that they often are written in a fairly, you know, short amount of time, because it's already sort of the things you're thinking about and doing, and you're trying to crystallize them on paper. This one was a bit more of a negotiation because I was really trying to talk about broader issues. One being why we consider police as a default response to people in mental health crisis in the first place, given their tendency and their training and the sort of overall climate of punishment and violence. This is not the kind of approach we want to take with people in mental health crisis. But also pointing to the very real issue of sort of the lack of funding and the lack of support and the cutting of support for mental health services. And so I sort of tried to build on that with this example of what had happened in Chicago to talk about those two issues, and specifically how Chicago and Illinois had really been sort of falling away from supporting services and closing mental health clinics. And then the last one I'd like to talk about is it's sort of also timely. So I think about, if the question is when to write an op-ed, I think it's great to be writing them at any time, to sort of be trying to jot down your ideas, your thinking, but I think it's especially relevant when there is something timely that's happening that your work can speak to. And the third one I'll talk about, which was in the Chicago Sun-Times, was really coming in response to the then governor of Illinois, Bruce Rauner, who had initiated a commission called the Illinois Commission on Criminal Justice and Sentencing Reform, and he tasked them with basically coming up with plans for the state to reduce the prison population by 25% in 10 years. So on its face, this was, clearly a decarceration effort. But there were concerns around sort of how this was being portrayed and what kinds of plans were being made. And so in our own thinking around, and this was written in conjunction with Carrie Pettis, who was the co-founder of the Promote Smart Decarceration Grand Challenge. In our own work around this, we had really been thinking about the parallels to deinstitutionalization of state-run psychiatric facilities and state hospitals, and how it was essentially a well-intended idea that was very poorly executed in terms of the kinds of equity and social justice outcomes that we would like to see. And so we really try to draw those parallels to challenge, folks in the state to think about not just cost savings measures around decarceration, but to also be planful, to build community support, and, to have a longer term sustainable strategy. So I'm happy to engage in Q&A later, but I guess the one thing I would say is, if you are writing things, you don't always have to wait until they can land somewhere in a major national, media outlet. We clearly have routes through social media, through our own networks, through our institutions, to be able to translate some of the work that we do into in sort of a focused message that can really spark a broader conversation.
Thanks a lot, Matt. That's very helpful. Look forward to getting some more of your insight in the Q&A section. Jenny, you're up next. Thanks.
All right, great. Well, thank you to Lisa and Willie and Kira and others who organized this. And thanks for you all who showed up to today's webinar. I already see a question in the Q&A section, which is great. Please add more in there because we have reserved some time at the end to talk all about this. So, and I'd also like to thank my fellow presenters here. I will second Lisa that sometimes op-eds don't take very long to write at all, especially when you have something to say, and that they're more fun than other writing. And as John says, also kind of you can always be thinking about writing op-eds, writing what you are thinking about. I wanted to talk in particular about two different kinds of op-eds I've done related to policy decisions. And one is I've done op-eds in the past when something has come up where I wanted to address. And then the second reason to do an op-ed is you want something to come up. You want to have something in the public agenda. And I'm actually going to talk more about the second one right now. I recently, last year, with my dean and a colleague, published an op-ed, I'll put the link in here, around wage equity issues for human services workers. And I wanted to highlight a few things about this work that wasn't maybe particularly obvious from reading it. I'll tell the story about this op-ed. This came about 2 years into me working with our local human services coalition and some people from the city of Seattle, both in the human services department there and on city council staff, who were concerned about the wages paid to human services workers at local nonprofits. And this had been a big issue that the local human services coalition, which is a group of nonprofits, they've been focused on it for a while, and with recent increases in cost of living and new pandemic related demands, a lot of our local human services organizations were losing staffing, in part because their wages were very low. We ended up doing a study funded by the city to answer the question of how much lower were these wages, and we worked with the coalition to try to get the results of our study and their policy recommendations out into the world. So that's kind of the background that you don't necessarily see within this op-ed. And I have a few reflections on that as well. One of the questions we were asked to address in this webinar is, what about op-eds makes them a potentially good tool for social workers? And as my other colleagues have mentioned here, op-eds are a great tool for reaching a broad audience. They're also helpful to reach certain elites, people who hold power and who read the daily newspaper. If you're thinking about how as a social worker to use them, I think some of the answer is kind of comes with the type of social worker you are. There are social workers who do direct practice, direct service work. There are social workers who are community organizers, who lead organizations, and there are social workers who do scholarship and research. We all have in common a code of ethics that calls for working for social change, but we play different roles within that. And within our different roles, we can bring a different types of knowledge or evidence to play in an op-ed. For instance, as a direct service worker, you can write about kind of your experiences delivering services, or what your clients and constituents are coming to you and saying. Leaders of organizations can talk about how well they are able to carry out the mission of their organization and what change they need or want to see to further those missions. As a scholar, I think my role is to talk about the work that I do that involves creating new kind of scientific knowledge, new evidence, new understanding. And I think that's helpful, often in conjunction with other things. So for instance, because the human services work that we were doing was in conjunction with a broad coalition, I had a lane, my colleagues and I had a lane to stay in, which is we were the university. We were here to say what they're asking for actually has some scientific evidence behind it. And that wasn't the same type of op-ed that, say, a human services executive director would have written. And we had executive directors who wrote op-eds within this campaign as well. So I think thinking about this work, sometimes it can be a one-off where your research has something directly relevant to the policy process, but sometimes where you're working in conjunction with other actors, and it's helpful to weigh in with the type of scholarship that you do. In the case of ours, we wanted to publicize the findings of our study, but our main interest really was in supporting the campaign and particularly getting the message out before the budget negotiations. So this wasn't, we could have written this op-ed at any point during our work after we had released the findings. We chose to write it during early, or to submit it for publication during the period after we had already presented it, but before the city was making their budget decisions. Had we released it in the middle of budget season, it would have already been too late. So one of the other questions we were asked to address was what came out of writing your op-ed? Did it have the desired impact? That's a tough one. It's hard to parcel out the impact of one piece of work within a much larger stream. In our case, I will say that the larger campaign was successful. The city budget has included an increase of about 9% for their nonprofit human services contractors. This is in a year where they're offering raises in the 2 to 4% to city unions. So I'd say that was a huge success there. The county has also preserved raises for the contractors. So I think I'm pleased with the work we did, and I think our op-ed was timed in a way that it was congruent with a larger set of actors and a larger set of goals. And I think that's kind of an example of policy practice within a larger environment of policy change. So I think that's what I have to say for now, but I look forward to questions and answers and discussing this with everybody.
Thanks a lot, Jenny. Also, thanks, Matt and Lisa. I think at this point, hopefully, everyone on this webinar is excited and can now see a path or a way forward for why they should write an op-ed. And now we're going to have John give us a little information on some tips about how to write op-eds.
Great, thanks, Willie. There I am on the screen. Let's see if I can. There we go. So yeah, I'm going to spend 10, 12, 15 minutes in there trying to distill down a few of the lessons. I think the stories that folks have already told actually carry a number of the ideas that I'm going to speak about here. We do a lot of work, as was noted earlier, with a variety of nonprofit organizations, foundations, government agencies, academic innovators like all of you, to help them with their communications and to use communications to create social change, social good, social justice. And so really pleased to be able to speak with all of you today about op-eds, which are a really powerful tool in that regard. And again, I think some really strong examples that you just heard from my colleagues on the panel. The first thing I do want to say is that one of the or perhaps the most important thing about op-eds is that it is an opportunity to take up your expertise, to take up your leadership, and to take up your voice in sort of new ways, in practical ways, and to kind of insert your insight, your expertise, and I would say desperately needed insight and expertise into the policy and the practice spheres in ways that can really do good. In terms of how then, once we've decided to to take on this role and to think about the op-ed, I have 10 tips, a top 10 list here about how to think about this work. So practically, first of all, as we've heard in a couple of cases already, timing is everything, and it's really important to be current, to respond to something that is happening in the news, in the broader world, whether it's a disaster, whether it's a bill that's being introduced, a terrible event, some violence, or perhaps even a celebration. And it's important to be able to be prepared with your op-ed to react when that issue flares. If you can put together that op-ed in an hour or two, timing is important, and it is important to be responsive to the events of the day, and certainly to respond to maybe a story in the newspaper or in the news more broadly within a few days, a week, or maybe 10 days at the most, so that again your op-ed is being responsive and current to the work that's happening. To that effect, I think as folks have described, it's often helpful to kind of put together a proto op-ed and to have the pieces of it, notes, or at least the structure of it together, and then be able to perhaps use the precipitating event or the hook when that comes around into the public consciousness. And in the meantime, you can even use some of those ideas to kind of micro blog, if you will, or do these micro op-eds through LinkedIn or through Twitter X or some other social media platform that is useful for you. So we start with timing and the importance there. The second tip is to think about, well, how do I, take this news that's out there and first of all, relate it to what's happening out there in those stories. So for example, if you do research on older adults and there's yet another story on the age of our prospective candidates, again, your op-ed can take advantage of that sort of general news item and to make more news about a discussion of ageism or workplace discrimination that you're interested in. Or perhaps you're working on reducing gun violence and there is yet another sort of mass shooting, or if you're working on extreme economic inequity and there's a report from the Department of Labor about that points to these inequities, or perhaps even some bad, irresponsible behavior from someone like Jeff Bezos or some other person in the 1% and the 0.1%. Again, those can be news hooks that you can pivot off of and extend to again make a little bit of news off of your own, and you might be able to sort of refocus the idea or a commonly held idea to focus on what you're most concerned with. You can take a telling detail from a story, perhaps about the American dream, and then perhaps talk something about how the American dream has changed. Or you can take something that's known every day and then create a hook that enables people to see that commonly held notion in a new and surprising manner. So again, second is make a little news of your own. 3, of course, don't assume, again, you are writing for a general audience for the most part. And, folks who are certainly less knowledgeable about the issues that you're writing about. So it's important that you don't assume that they know a whole lot about your issue and certainly about the technical pieces of your issue. So you really do want to figure out a way to create context and create a sense of background about the issue quickly, and because again you're writing likely in some length of 650, maybe up to perhaps 1,500 words. So you can't take the time you normally take in an academic paper to create that background, but quickly and efficiently giving people a sense of where they how they're meant to think about a particular point of view, and then obviously to eliminate any technical or high concept language, abbreviations, and of course to speak plainly is really important. The fourth thing I wanted to talk about is about about starting and finishing strong. Again, there are a lot of ways to begin or finish the piece, but again, in a newspaper, particularly the first item or the first part of a story, the lead, is critically important. People like to use the term bluff, bottom line up front, which is very much not the same way we work on academic papers where the conclusions are at the end. But again, we want to, in your op-ed, you want to figure out a way to start strong and again, to leave them with something interesting as well. And in fact, I think Lisa mentioned the op-ed project. They set out a very, I think, helpful sort of overall structure for an op-ed. And again, it starts with a strong idea or lead and ends with a strong conclusion. It then includes in a couple of sentences the argument, your point of view. It then goes to sort of two or three pieces of evidence that kind of back up your point. And then before you get to that final conclusion, there is oftentimes what they call the to be sure paragraph, which basically calls out the other side and describes the contrary, the con of your argument, con to your argument, so that again it suggests that again you're not operating in some kind of fantasy land, but in fact you are very cognizant of the sort of competing ideas that are out there, and again builds credibility for your argument before you're able to again finish strongly and to give people a clear sense of what it is that you really want them to remember. But this is a kind of very good, helpful structure. And again, if you're trying to write something quickly, this is a good place to start. Number 5 in our top 10 is to again make the work meaningful, and making it meaningful obviously will be meaningful to you because you've decided to write about the piece. But really, you want to focus on sort of making it meaningful to the broader audience and to the broader public, making it meaningful to them. And one of the ways you can do that is by ensuring that the way you use sort of evidence can be done and can be framed in a way that is connected to and engaging to your broader audience. Even how you kind of talk about statistics and data, in particular, translating that as you see here around the statistic about mental health, that kind of gives you a clear sense of what you're talking about, as opposed to sort of these technical terms around disability adjusted life years, et cetera, which are again important to us, but perhaps not as important or not known to the broader world. You obviously want to eliminate jargon, again, which is important for academic writing and important to kind of when you're trying to write really precisely in an academic forum, but less helpful and important in your work for around an op-ed. And then you want to make sure that the way you state this evidence is described in pictures and in terms that people can readily understand, and that enables them to kind of connect it to their own context and lives. And one of the great ways to do that is to make it personal and to tell stories about how, as we heard earlier, about stories from Lisa at the very beginning about how the tragedy, the tornado tragedy that she described, was so important and so caused a great deal of self-reflection for her personally, and how to and including that in the op-ed again creates a way of helping the reader understand where you're coming from, and again creates a more compelling piece of writing. 6, again, this is very much related to the previous point. Again, you want to tell stories. Stories are a kind of evidence in this case. In the academic world, maybe stories are sort of N of 1, if you will. But in the case of op-eds, they can be at least as powerful as a data point or 3 or 4. And again, are a way of kind of connecting people to ideas and issues that are relatively remote or new to them in different ways. And these stories can be your own stories and your own reflection on a particular, or own experience on around a particular issue, or they can include stories of other people, sometimes de-identified, always used with permission if you're going to tell someone a real story. But again, a way of providing important and I guess quite dynamic evidence for the broader point that you're trying to make. 7 is again, be yourself. Little description there, a little visual description there, visual pun. Again, as we heard earlier, op-eds are an opportunity to write in a sort of more colloquial, perhaps a little more authentic voice, certainly not a sort of an academic voice that you may be used to writing. And it's a way for you to be to kind of again perhaps connect to ideas issues, feelings particularly, that you're not able to access as you put together a more erudite academic journal paper or chapter or even book. Number 8, and this is sort of in terms of the technical pieces. Most op-eds had been published in print settings, and in fact they still are in certain places, certain cases, and because they are in narrow columns, it would be important to have very short paragraphs. So the style that you see in most, even digitally, the style that you see in most op-eds is for very short paragraphs. So you do want to, even one sentence, 2 short sentences, and then you hit the return key and go on to the next piece of business. Again, these are short, distilled pieces of writing that take complex ideas and really try to boil them down to their essence. And again, if you can think about this in terms of think about your writing in these terms and in these short paragraphs, you can also again develop a sort of a pacing that can be very helpful and can help you get to get through your argument in the relatively short number of words or few number of words that are required in an op-ed. Number 9, again, this is something that I want to note quite carefully here, because in fact, oftentimes when we see something in the news, we are outraged, and we have a critical point of view that is perhaps very well supported, and there can be a tendency to kind of make that counterpoint of view without offering solutions and ways to kind of move forward, and the op-ed editors are going to be expecting and in some cases demanding that you include those solutions as part of your piece. In the world of framing, and from the Frameworks Institute in Washington, D.C., they also suggest that messages in general that don't include solutions create a sense of fatalism, that all it does is leave people with a sense of this huge problem and no way to kind of address it. And in fact, without the solutions, rather than creating some sense of action or momentum, it really creates a more apathy and inaction in the use of these messages and indeed in op-eds. And finally, the last tip I have is tips around sort of placing the op-ed. It's great to be able to pull the op-ed together. And again, you can always use pieces of it and even all of it in LinkedIn or in some other social media context. But some things to think about in terms of your placements. First, you want to be somewhat realistic, right? So, again, we heard, Matt told us a story about placing it in the New York Times, places like the Washington Post. These big national venues are not necessarily out of reach for folks. And in fact, if there is that much, if you are indeed perfectly positioned to respond to a big national issue, then a place like the New York Times, the Washington Post, etc., may be a useful place to start. At the same time, they get thousands, I would say 1,200 or so by one count of submissions every week, and so just to understand that it's a challenge to kind of get heard in that cacophony of different pieces and points of view. So you may want to think about someplace local, and again, maybe someplace connected to your more directly connected to the issue, or perhaps directly connected to your to some other affiliation that you may have as well. Second, you want to very closely, before you submit, you want to look at the publication and its op-eds policy. You want to read some of the other op-eds that have been published there and understand what is the word count, and understand what's allowed to be submitted and what isn't. One thing I do want to mention is that you can't submit an op-ed to multiple places at once. You can only do it one at a time. Usually the folks we'll let you know either within 2 or 3 days, or if you haven't heard in 2 or 3 days, you can then go on to the next one. But again, you can't submit to a large group, and you certainly cannot publish the same op-ed in different places, because that ultimately is the property of the newspaper that's there. And finally, I would just say, look, if you first you don't succeed, just because you can't do them all at once, you can continue to try to find homes for it. And as we heard in one case, there may be a precipitating event that comes up in the next 2 months or 3 months or 6 months later, and then all of a sudden your op-ed gets the consideration and the attention and the publication that it ultimately deserves. So those are my top 10 tips. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Willie to handle any questions, and look forward to talking more with all of you in the Q&A.
Thanks a lot, John. Truly appreciate you sharing that information with us. I know it's difficult to do in such a short time period. In 15 minutes, teach people how to write an op-ed. But the point of this webinar is more or less to introduce you all to the idea that its importance and its potential importance for you is something you might not have thought about, and give you some tips on how to do that. So right now, we're going to jump into the questions and answers. We have 2 questions right now in the queue. We hope to get more, so please don't be shy. Send us your questions. We'd love to answer them. And we have some great people here to answer it. The first question I'm going to read aloud, and it can really go to anybody, so everybody can take a chance at answering this. Do you include your university affiliation when you publish op-eds? My opinions and advocacy don't necessarily reflect views of my university, nor do I seek institutional review or approval before I submit them, or maybe I should be doing so. Jeffrey asked. So anyone like to answer that?
I can start. In my case, I've been at 2 universities, one public, one private, and in both cases, I've always included my affiliation. One thing you can do if you're not sure is get to know, which you should, I think academics should do this anyway, get to know your university's director of media relations or media relations manager. You can always run the question by them. Is there a formal policy or not at the university around these, especially as relates to academic freedom? Plus, just a plug for getting to know your media relations manager, because then if they know you and your work, they'll also think of you for when opportunities like, media interviews, radio, TV, news articles come up. You'll be on their radar as somebody they can reach out to.
Real quick on just piggybacking off of that, and it can also be useful in promoting the op-ed within certain groups around the university and in their reach outside of the university, alumni and such. So also can be useful for that reason. Jenny, I think you have something.
I think it is important to use your university affiliation. I always would, and to second Lisa's reference on academic freedom, you certainly shouldn't need to seek institutional permission if you're affiliated with a university in a faculty role where you should have kind of your academic freedom. For people who are in working in a nonprofit organization or working in government, you may have different restrictions, and certainly you shouldn't use your professional affiliation unless you've cleared that with your organization. I know in particular, people working in government often have real restrictions on influencing public debate. So I think it really depends on where you're sitting for that.
John?
Yeah, well, so I was going to say, I would agree with Jenny for sure, and Lisa actually with particularly that point about checking with the communications office, just to more for the other side of that promotion piece rather than permission. Always better than forgiveness than permission, right? But I would say that your affiliation is actually a key kind of credibility marker for the editor. You are not just simply Joe, Josie, Q citizen. You are someone with that kind of that academic standing, and particularly that will oftentimes be an important piece of your pitch, if you will, to get your piece published.
The only thing I would add is, yes, I have included my institutional affiliation. I did not seek out approval, before submitting op-eds. I happen to be at an institution that likes to pride itself on, academic freedom. We could have a debate, another conversation about the extent to which they do that. But especially in today's climate, we know that especially academics are at a range of institutions, some of which are public institutions that have really instituted some policies and practices that have challenged the principles of academic freedom as it relates to teaching, as it relates to scholarship. And so I think if there are folks who are questioning that, it might be wise to speak out. And what everyone has said about, if you have like a public relations or media relations person, those are excellent folks to help navigate that with you.
I'll say one more thing on that topic before we go to the next question. And that simply is I think if you're, and this is certainly just a rule of thumb, but not anything that you have to take as gospel or you have to hold to, is if you're talking about your research in the research issues, you're probably in a relatively safe space in that you're talking about these things anyhow, articles and everything else. So the school won't be caught off guard. You wouldn't think that it would create any kind of major commotion. I might say personally, this is just a personal thing. If I understand, because I'm in admin, at the school a lot, and there are a lot of contentious issues nowadays among the students and within our student body. And so if I knew I was taking a hard stance on one of those, I might inform my dean, just out of courtesy, not out of I have to, because there might be a student response to those things. But when I've done op-eds, they've been on my research, and I haven't reached out to anybody. But that's in my mind. I would probably reach out if I thought the issue was one that was going to rally up some, student outcries or faculty or whomever else. Okay, so that's just something to think about. Not a mandatory, but something you might want to have in your mind. The second question is, how do you decide which outlet to approach or submit? By David. Go ahead, John. You're off mute.
This is an art, not a science. I had a couple of comments around that. Again, your local newspaper, if there is a for example, in the health world, there are a lot of health trades and places that take op-eds. There's commentary even in academic journals, which is a place that you might consider. But though, in terms of, I think the most important thing is to get it published. And again, you want it in the biggest publication possible, and you should try. But the key is once you get it, because the work doesn't end once it gets published. In fact, the work sort of just begins. We're talking a little bit about impact later, right? So one piece, it can be poetry, it can be incisive and mind changing, world changing. But people still have to hear about it, right? And so once there's a link to it somewhere, then you can use all sorts of other promotional and sort of dissemination sort of tactics that enable you to spread that word much further and to bring people to the writing in helpful ways. And so yes, better to kind of go to a big national or as big a publication as possible, but most important to get it published.
Yeah,
Matt, I think Matt had something next.
Oh, I was just quickly going to say, I mean, I think it depends on what you're writing and who might be the primary audience. So like for the example I brought up about Illinois and the state commission around reducing prison, that was very specific to Illinois. We started with the largest newspapers in Illinois and were able to get some engagement with the Chicago Sun-Times. Of course, we could have, published that somewhere else, but I think, thinking of who might think of the content and the focus that's most relevant for their readership was part of what guided our decision.
And
Yeah,
Jenny,
I want to second with Matt, for something that's a statewide issue, publishing it in state is probably better than publishing it nationally, certainly. Thinking about the local newspaper in the state capital, if that's different than the most widely read newspaper, that's another option. And then there are also increasingly online media outlets. There's the network of organizations that cover state government in about 20 states. I'm blanking on their name, but I can put the link in below. Often, just as John said, having something published and then promoting it out, sending an email to every council member or every member of the legislature that says, I just published this and let me know if you or your staff want to talk more about it. Particularly if you're working with a coalition, you wouldn't even have to be the person doing this. It could be an organizer on the coalition as well. So.
And I'll add real quick to another kind of outlet to think about is professional publications as well. So just as an example, one that I didn't talk about earlier, but it was with the New Social Worker magazine, and it was intentionally written for practitioners as part of, talking more about climate justice with practitioners every day. And that is part of ultimately contributing to policy advocacy as well, because it's building that foundation amongst practitioners. So what are the professional publications that you can write for also?
yes, so we have to wrap up in about 4 minutes. So a quick couple notes. One would be, is I'm piggybacking off of Lisa. The one I've done with the conversation is another kind of professional group that does op-eds and stuff, short pieces. And they actually what's nice about some of those places, they get a lot of attention in other places. So you write something there, and Atlantic Monthly picks it up, and other people pick it up and translate it out. So it can be a very powerful. In like the conversation is tailored towards academic writing into academia, and so it's really a kind of a nice place to go. I would also say think about centers. Some centers do kind of blogs and op-eds and types of things that are useful that get pushed out again to other venues. Okay, so this is just our first foray, I guess you would say, into kind of advocacy and thinking about different ways of doing advocacy that social workers can think about that we maybe aren't thinking about and aren't as active in. So op-eds is just one of those areas. We're thinking about things like writing briefs and just any other kind of thing that you might think of. And so if you have suggestions on different areas you might want to see, for sure, send us an email, put it in the chat or wherever else, and let us know some other types of webinars around these types of ideas that you'd like to see. We'd like to produce them and get them available to you. And then lastly, I just want to thank all of the panelists for their time. I know you're all very busy and have done great work. I'm sure if you have additional questions, they'd be willing to answer them if you have emails. And I'd ask of all the participants, first, thank you for showing up, but then also help push out the recording so that others of your colleagues and even your students can see this and begin to think about op-eds as maybe a viable way for sharing their research and doing some advocacy. So thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, Willie. Bye-bye.